It's an enormous pleasure to be back here. I've done this a few times. I'm Steve Erlanger with the New York Times, and I have the great privilege, I would say, honor, we'll see, but privilege to have with me Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who I think is a role model for lots of people all over the world. She is former Nigerian finance minister for 7 years, which would have given me gray hair, which I got anyway. She was foreign minister for a bit. She's been running this very complicated multilateral institution called the World Trade Organization for 4 years and has just been renominated for a second term, which maybe is a good thing.
I don't know.
But what we're going to do is have a bit of a conversation, and then I'm going to open it up to your questions. I'm told you are, as you know, all invited to participate using the online conversation with this QR code on the slide. You can share your opinions. You can disagree with statements. And of course, don't be too obnoxious, but none of you would be, I'm sure, in your comments. So the WTO was set up in happier times, I guess I would say. And it's run into difficulties in creating multilateral trade regulations because the world has gotten complicated. The issue of China is a big issue. But now we have this kind of wave of, particularly coming from my country, President Trump, real distrust of multilateral institutions, a real sense that trade is not something that is good for everyone, but trade must be done for national interests. I mean, Trump is obsessed with trade imbalances and has even threatened to hold back security from countries who have too big a trade imbalance with the United States. I think he has a very weird idea of tariffs, but he thinks it's a word that should be put into the Bible. So the first question I want to ask you is, what would you try to tell President Trump about tariffs that he doesn't understand?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't presume to tell President Trump what to think about tariffs, because I think he has made up his mind about tariffs. And since for him, tariffs is as good a word as love. So even before talking about the Bible, he thinks it's the better word than love as good. So it means that I don't think one should try to convince him not to like tariffs, but one can try to explain why the use of measures such as tariffs may not result in the kinds of outcomes that may be expected. Now, when you use tariffs for non-trade purposes, yes, as a weapon or as leverage, perhaps you can get the dialogue going and get the outcomes you're looking for. But the first thing I want to tell the world, and I just said it coming out of Davos about this tariff issue, is please do not hyperventilate, okay, about tariffs. Take a deep breath and let's chill, okay? I mean, if we sit here waiting for the next pronouncement on tariffs we lose focus. When the tariffs are announced, then we'll deal with them. We've certainly been doing quite a bit of analysis at the WTO about the impacts of various types and levels. So we at least have an idea of what it would mean. But I would tell the world and the business community, and I think the message was well received, just chill. Chill, because if you hyperventilate and you spend all your time, it also, and I said it to leaders too, it leads you perhaps to take the wrong decision. You react. One tariff is levied, you levy your own. And then it results in a tit for tat. And a tit for tat tariff war is really bad for the world. I'll just give you one number. We have estimated that if we have the world split into two geopolitical blocks, not trading with each across with each other, according to UN voting patterns, and we layer in this trade policy uncertainty that we are living with now, you're going to have a real global GDP loss in the longer term of 6.4%. Fragmentation, that is $6.75 trillion. It's like losing the economies of Japan and Korea put together. The world cannot afford that. Then if you do an all-out tit-for-tat tariffs at the level of 25, 60%, all them, leads to double-digit global GDP losses.
Well,
that's horrific.
I mean, to some degree, Trump throws these figures around. I mean, he was talking about 100% tariffs on this one, and 50% on this one, and 20% on this one. But as you said, let's see what actually happens.
And can I just say two things on that? Number one is, I think that when a tariff is announced, the first thing to do is to take a deep breath and enter into dialogue with President Trump. I think if you do that and use the appropriate back channels, you might actually come up with a win-win like Colombia just did.
Why don't you explain that to people?
Yeah, Colombia.
Why you saw it as a win-win?
Yeah, it was a win-win. The way it's being reported in the press is as if Colombia lost or caved in. They didn't really. I was up on Sunday night. As soon as it happened, I got a call from the Colombian ambassador, and we were on the phone. What is the advice? And my advice was this. Of course, something tantamount to take it easy. I didn't say chill. Take it because it wasn't a chilling moment. I said chill till we get the tariffs. So we got the tariffs. I said take it easy. Tell the president, what is he wanting to do? The president never said that he didn't want his citizens back. He said he didn't want them back in shackles, in an undignified situation, which is good enough. So what happened was the president decided to send planes to pick up the Colombian citizens, brought them back. And if you saw a picture of them, they were pretty happy, smiling inside the plane. He's also a populist leader on the left. So he won. People saw him, his people, as having done the right thing. Sure. President Trump also won because he got the migrants taken back. Right. It should have been presented as win-win on both sides, but the press was only reporting it. And I think we need to balance these reports in the press.
Part of the problem is if you tell the Danish prime minister to chill, she's already worried about Greenland, which is cold enough.
No, but yes, but she chill means there's always room for dialogue.
Well, that's what I think Trump, first of all, we have to figure out what the president wants. I'm not sure he knows what he wants. I mean, I
think he knows.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I keep thinking the best description of him was John Bolton's. He said working in the White House was like living inside a pinball machine. So things move around with him. So on the WTO, talk to me a bit about China. China still wants to be treated as a developing country, not a developed country. I mean, does this make sense to you? Is this an absurdity at this point?
Well, what doesn't make a great deal of sense, and I'm sure Arantxa can tell you all about it because she was living in this organization. When I arrived, I didn't understand, having spent a bit of my career at the World Bank for 25 years before going to be finance minister, was that you could self-describe yourself to be what you want, developed or developing. And I'd never seen that because at the bank and the fund, it's very clear what are least developed countries, lower middle income, upper middle. I'm sure you all have those, the criteria and the numbers. So to arrive, and it's if you want to call yourself developed you can. So the countries there, many of them didn't make these rules. But I think it happened at a time when there was a small group of countries, all like-minded, who created these organizations. Remember, the WTO is not just 30 years old, it's actually 80, because it's the successor to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So, then it was created, you could do this. So number one, it cannot be blamed if we're, But what I want to share with you is the issue is not the name you call yourself. It's what it allows you access to at the WTO. And if you're a developing country, then you have access to what is called special and differential treatment, meaning you can have additional room or flexibilities to implement agreements, perhaps a longer time period, perhaps you're carved out of some of the disciplines, the requirements in the agreement because you're developing and you need more time and you need more room. So it's okay for China to call itself developing, but the issue is having access to those flexibilities.
Right.
And that is what we're really trying to persuade them, that they shouldn't. Call yourself the name you want, but don't have access. And I think we are making headway. This is an ongoing conversation. Right. They've just, in the harmful fisheries subsidies agreement we did 2 years ago, they signed, they undertook they would not have access. Of course, they couldn't because they're one of the big subsidizers, but at least they signed. Now they've just declared last week there's a whole set of negotiations that developing countries are interested in. And part of it is being blocked because China, being a developing country, they're arguing for more flexibilities.
Right. China
has just announced it will not seek special and differential treatment for those negotiations. They are willing to do it. These are the G90 proposals, Arantxa. I don't want to get too techy here or too detailed in the weeds. But it's big.
Yeah.
So we're moving them and telling them, look, you've got to make the presumption that you will not have access.
Well, one of the things that I see about China is it on the one hand, it wants to set up its own institutions, its own development banks. It's crucial for the BRICS, right? And yet, on the other hand, it wants more power within the existing multilateral institutions. You can see the Chinese pushing good people through the UN system and other. Do you see that in your organization? Do you see this kind of slight contradiction in Chinese aims and tactics?
I don't think there's a contradiction at all. China, so the WTO is a little different from the other organizations. So at the Bank and Fund, it's all by shareholding. And the largest shareholders are the US and other Western countries. Some European countries, if you put them together, have a larger shareholding than China, which is the second largest economy. So that's not right. Developing countries now contribute about 58% to global GDP. So the balance of contributions is changing. That means that if this is part of what you look at, you need to recalibrate the quota system at the fund and the shareholding. But the people who have the largest shareholding now are not really willing to do that.
I don't know.
So because they are not willing, right, China decided to start developing its own institutions where, it can have also some preeminence. So one has been a consequence of the other, right, but it's still seeking to have its rightful place. Now, at the WTO, it's different. We are not a shareholding kind of thing. When we're quite proud that each member, the tiniest island economy with, 30, 50,000 people, whatever the population may be, has the same voice at the WTO as the United States or UK or China. And we decide everything by consensus. So this is pretty unique, and it's to be treasured. But it has its drawbacks. When you have a consensus system in which any one member can veto, it can result in gridlock. And it does. That is why it takes 22. Why should it take 22 years to negotiate an agreement to do away with harmful fisheries subsidies?
Exactly.
22 billion. That's what I said. What's going on here? This is a sustainability issue. We're 7% overfished in 1970. Now we're at 49, almost 50% overfished today, meaning we will not leave any fish for any of these young people if we don't do something. So we're absolutely determined, and it's because of that. One member can stop,
right,
or a group of members, whatever. We've got to find a way through. But in 2022, we're lucky to be able to break that and actually get the first part of this agreement to stop illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing of our high seas. Africa loses $11 billion a year to illegal fishing, 11 billion. So this is not trivial, okay? So our governance system, so the issue now is how do we maintain this beautiful governance where everybody has a voice and yet find a way, some of my members call it responsible consensus, find a way to make it work better. We have to tweak it somehow. We have to do a reform. So we are not held up and we can negotiate good agreements for the world faster.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the issues of the WTO, and again, it gets a bit complicated, but there's an appellate procedure, an appeal procedure with judges, and it's been frozen for years because countries, including the United States, can't agree on naming new judges.
It's the United States that couldn't agree.
Yeah, could you explain that a bit?
Well, first, there are two things I want to say. I think it's a shame that the WTO got characterized just by one function, which is its dispute settlement function. And as soon as, and that's a two-tier system, like a court. There's the panel level, which is like your lower court, and the appellate level, which is like the appeals body, where members can appeal decisions and have them looked at. And what happened was that the United States, not just President Trump, it pervades this bilateral thing, and it just happened that during his time, then the election of the last set of judges that could have made the place functional was going to be done, and they blocked it. So the second tier is blocked. And so if you appeal, there are no judges to look at the appeal. So it's like appealing to the void, meaning nothing happens, which is not very good. But the organization became characterized by one function. It has a negotiating function, a monitoring function, a dispute settlement, and one function. Everybody began to say WTO is dysfunctional. It is not. The appellate body is, because it's not. But the panel level is still working. And members are still bringing cases. There are about 7 disputes in front of it now. And I actually think that some lessons have been learned in this. So yes, the ideal is to have it working.
Sure.
But I'm just wanting people to know that because it's not working, members have learned to dialogue with each other more. There's an alternative system called the MPIA, an arbitration system that the European Union started. Some members are using that. Others are talking to each other more. There was a dispute between China and Australia where China had put, an embargo on certain Australian exports. And China is a large market for Australia.
It was very political.
It was very political. It was because of what they said on the COVID-19 virus. So it was a use again of trade as an instrument to solve another problem that was not really trade related. But in the end, after Australia brought a dispute, they decided to send signals. They would like a dialogue. We got into it. We were able to help them. And lo and behold, China and Australia talking to each other have resolved almost all of those disputes. Wine, barley, beef, all the things that were being blocked have started flowing. So even though the dispute settlement system, the second tier doesn't work, dispute settlement is still ongoing, and it is making members look at alternatives, which was also part of what was planned, that you shouldn't take everything to the panel and appellate body immediately. So maybe there's been some good to it, but the truth is we need to reform that system and bring it back to full functioning.
Some people have said in the past that, the WTO, like other institutions, favors developed countries just because they're bigger and they have more assets and so on. Do you find that to be true? Are there ways to work around that?
Well, certainly the developing countries, the poorer countries, feel that they're not benefiting from the system as much as they should. And if you look at some of the numbers, it certainly seems to bear them out. Africa's trade has stagnated at around 3% and less over these decades. The Africa's share of world trade, the least developed countries, their share of world trade has stagnated around 1%. So they've not benefited. Trade has lifted 1.5 billion people out of poverty. A lot in East Asia, but all around the world. But there are poor regions in rich countries that have not benefited, which leads to populism. And there are poor countries that have not benefited as much. And we have to admit that. So they would say, the developing countries, that they need to benefit more. And if you look at the numbers, you would agree. So the issue, why is this not happening? You certainly cannot trade more if you don't add more value to your products. And so let's take the African continent. We're still exporting commodities, raw commodities mostly.
Right.
So the issue is, how can we get the necessary investment to process this so we can add value? And when we add value, how do we avoid other members putting non-tariff barriers and other requirements that stop the value-added products from selling? So those are two things that we're looking at the WTO, and we do have answers. Mm-hmm. Number one, you want to get more, this is an opportune time, actually, you know, and people say, why are you so cheerful? You should be going around with a long face and in panic because of tariffs. Actually, I'm not, because I see quite a few opportunities for poorer countries. Number one, we have seen that value chains and supply chains have been too concentrated, either on certain geographies or for certain products. Let me explain myself. During the pandemic, we found that 10 countries in the world export 80% of the world's vaccines. How is that? And this was why people were dying. They were not able to get vaccines because that supply chain and value chain is too concentrated. Needs to be decentralized. 90% of semiconductors plus made in one country, we call it Chinese Taipei, Taiwan. Is that resilient for the world? Absolutely not. 70% of the world's critical minerals processed in one country, China, 36% of the reserves of critical minerals in one country. Is that resilient for the world? No. So there are certain value chains that are too concentrated. It is now the time for developing countries that have a lot of those things. Let's take critical minerals. You can find them in many countries in Africa, even my own country, Nigeria, I've just found lithium. All those things, Central Asia has them. I've just been talking to the presidents there to get together so they can have a way of working with each other to attract the supply chains. Latin America, this is the time to persuade business to decentralize these value chains. Some of these countries also have what we call at the WTO, a green comparative advantage. Africa has 60% of the world's solar potential, but attracts only 2% of investment in solar. Why is that? So if you could attract more investment, you could actually process these critical minerals in a clean fashion. Right. It's a win-win for the world.
Right. Because I mean, part of what struck me always is during the COVID thing, everyone talked about resilience and everyone worried about where the aspirin was coming from and the ibuprofen and let alone these critical materials. But one country's resilience is another country's protectionism, right? I mean, that's the problem. And I'm curious, because you got very involved with Gavi, which was this effort to get more COVID vaccines to the developing world. I mean, what were the lessons that you pulled out of that experience?
I think, part of the lesson was what I just said, the lessons. I was chair of the board of the Global Alliance for Vaccines for 5 years. And I think actually part of that experience may have helped me when I competed for the job of WTO DG, because there was a hot debate going on about developing countries, about vaccines and the protection of intellectual property and developing countries wanting to be able to manufacture some of these vaccines. WTO is the home of something called the Trade-Related Intellectual Properties Agreement, TRIPS. And why, I don't know, but we are. But we protect the intellectual property for research and innovation in the world. And so that knowledge about vaccines and so on may have helped. What we learned is, number one, what I just said. It doesn't really build global resilience to have the manufacture of life-saving medicines concentrated in so few countries in the world. I think we need to decentralize it. You can still protect intellectual property. My advice to farmers, because we have to reward research and innovation, right, don't we? If we don't reward it, no one will innovate. Nobody will invest. So I really believe in that. However, you can also share technology. You can share, technologies, particularly when it comes to saving lives. And when you share and you decentralize and so on, you can control and have agreements. If you're forced to do it, then you might not have control. So my advice to the pharmaceutical company CEOs was to be ahead in terms of trying to transfer technologies for your products.
Yes,
Don't wait to be forced. So that was a lesson. We have to decentralize manufacture of these products. We have to do more learning and innovation in our own developing countries, so we have to invest ourselves. And can I just say one thing? I said all these things about decentralizing supply chains. However, the world is competitive. If you don't put in place the right governance mechanisms, if you don't sweep away the bureaucracy in facing investment in your country, you're not going to be attractive. So developing country leaders also have to do that. We have an instrument at the WTO we're negotiating called the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. 126 countries, members, are negotiating it. And when we get it through, it means if you sign onto it, you can domesticate the agreement, and then you can become attractive for investors.
Well, this is one of the big issues in Brussels right now, right? I mean, is EU regulation protecting us so much so that no one's innovating? It's too expensive, it's too difficult, it's too hard to get capital. And this is, part of, I think, Europe's confrontation with its lack of growth, which is quite severe and which is hurting the promise of the EU. I want you all to come up with some questions. I have one last question, but in the meantime, please think of some questions for Ngozi. The last thing I want to ask you is really about climate. I mean, it's sort of out there. We talk about it, we agonize about it, and Trump's pulled out of the Paris Agreement again. Not that it mattered that much the first time, because California is bigger than most countries all by itself. But how is the WTO? I mean, can you help with climate? Are there ways where you can help push this forward?
So there's this narrative or belief that trade is negative for climate, for reducing carbon emissions. And part of that may be true because the logistics of trade and moving goods generates carbon emissions. But I'm not so concerned about that because we have all this innovation going on. I meet with the CEOs of the shipping companies and others to find out what they're doing. This is something I've started to do. And they're all working really on green hydrogen and other types of fuels. So they're taking it seriously. It might mean different types of ships that may not be as large as the ones. That's what they're telling me. It might mean reconfiguring supply chains in a way with more regional routes, but they're working on it. So I think we'll come out, and the International Maritime Organization is working on it. But you cannot get to net zero by 2050 without trade. You just can't do it. And it is this narrative that is not getting out. As someone who has seen climate change work in my own village, where the farmers are telling me that, look, we don't know when to plant anymore, there's too much rain, at this time when we want to harvest, there's too much. So this is real. They don't call it climate change, but something is not right, and it's affecting them. So you can believe whatever you like, but when you speak to real people on the ground and they tell you what is happening, then you... So I said, we have to change this narrative. You cannot... The technologies needed for mitigation of carbon emissions can only get diffused through trade.
That's right.
How do you take the technology made here from one place to the other? Just think about it. It's trade that helps you It's trade that helps you get the economies of scale that reduces the cost of these technologies, right? And gets it from one place to the other. So that narrative needs to be known. Secondly, I think that when the nationally determined contributions were done, they didn't really think about trade because everybody had this other side. But there's so many tools that trade can contribute to help get to net zero. And we did it for COP28. We did a brochure and just said 10 tools, 10 trade policies and tools. I'll just give you one. You know, when I was Minister of Finance in my country, I found that because we wanted the aspiration of young people and lower middle class was to own a car, we were letting in diesel engines, second-hand cars from Europe at very low tariffs, the most polluting. Whereas I had a hybrid already then, and electric vehicles were being charged higher tariffs. And if you look at the tariff regime, you see in many countries up to 12% tariffs on EVs and hybrids, and much lower tariffs on fossil fuel vehicles and equipment. That's already one thing you can correct, because you want to incentivize the use of non-polluting things. So look at your tariff regimes and see how you can correct this so you can incentivize clean energy, solar panels, EVs, and things like that. It's a common mistake. I'll give you just one more example. We have an agreement at the WTO called the Government Procurement Agreement, which is a plurilateral, meaning not everyone belongs to it. About 49 countries belong to it. Government procurement is a $13 trillion business. And when you want to procure, you, as a government, can incentivize those who you're procuring from to buy green. That's another tool that you can use. And I could go on and on. So we've made these 10 trade policy tools that support the lowering of carbon emissions. Subsidies. We are here looking for peanuts for the loss and damage fund. When we get $700 million, we're very happy. But do you know that even in the harmful fishery subsidies, we're trying to phase out $22 billion in subsidies that are doing the wrong thing? What if about even $5 billion of that were put in the loss and damage fund? You have $630 billion in trade-distorting agricultural subsidies, $1.2 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies. Yes. So why are we looking for peanuts? We need to be real, and we need to not be hypocritical. We have to reform. Now, reforming subsidies is one of the hardest political things you can ever do.
Just ask Elon Musk.
Ask me. We tried to do it in Nigeria to do away, and we went halfway during my time. We did do it. We phased out $6 billion. So I'm not being unrealistic. I don't expect all of this to be reformed. But even 1/3, a portion of that phased out, could help finance a just transition in developing countries.
Let's get some questions from you. I don't know if there's a microphone. I mean, I guess there are microphones on the sides of each room. So if you want to stand in front of a microphone, I would only ask that you identify yourself, which would be nice, and that you actually ask a question. Okay? So, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Director General, for your lesson. I'm Nicola, and I'm a student in the Master in International Governance and Diplomacy, and I'm currently following a course on WTO policy. So I wanted to ask you a question.
So that'll be a good question.
Yes, I hope so. Getting back to the branch, the judicial branch of the WTO. Why do you think it has become, according to the popular opinion, the branch that is used to characterize the WTO, and somehow it has shifted the focus from trade to judicial? And second, don't you think that by countries, for instance, relying on some kind of parallel mechanism, such as the MPIA, countries are going somehow to ignore the problem of replacing the judges, and so the deadlock will continue to endure?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's take, let's say, three. Why don't we go to this woman over on this side?
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I'm a student at the International Development Master. I'm from Mexico, so maybe that's the nature of my question. So, how can countries establish firm boundaries with Trump while mitigating the risk of severe repercussions that would come together with the imposition of tariffs?
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah.
Just say it slowly, it'll help.
Okay.
How can
Countries establish firm boundaries with Trump while mitigating the risk of the severe repercussions that would come together with the imposition of trade tariffs?
Okay, good, thanks. And we'll take one more here.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Director General. I'm Aman, a first year in international development. My question is in regard to patents. You talked about the need to reward innovation and, compensate them, but how do you also balance that, what you said, the need to decentralize value chains? What actual policy can find this balance and compensate those producer countries?
Okay. Do you want to answer some of those?
Okay. Yeah, on the first question of the dispute settlement system and appellate body and the shift of focus about the WTO to become just this, I was very surprised. And I really think it's most unfortunate. I think because of the drama surrounding, not allowing judges to be, and because it's the only quote unquote court for trade in the world. So it's called the WTO's crown jewel. It's the only place really for multilateral. I mean, there are different other systems elsewhere, but this is the only multilateral one. So I think it got really famous, and you've got tons of people doing WTO law and degrees and masters in WTO studies, and they're all focusing on this issue, right? So I think it was the tail in a way. Maybe tail wagging the dog may not be apt, but I think it took over too much preeminence. One of the things that attracted me to the WTO that people don't even know, in the preamble to the agreement that set it up, called the Marrakesh Agreement, it says that the purpose of the WTO is to enhance living standards, help create employment, and support sustainable development. I could not find a purpose more attractive because it's all about people and about planet. So it's not about this judicial system. And so I think that it is a pity it was taken over, by just there were many cases between the US and China, US and EU on steel and others that became really famous, and I think that drove so that's why. But we need to shift the narrative to where it belongs, that this is one function of the WTO, but it is not the only thing about the WTO, and the rest of the functions are really going on well. And bear with me, because this is the time I want to say, before I answer the second part of your question, the WTO is beyond tariffs, okay? What do I mean? It is the home of 2 or 3 or 4 agreements that build trust in trade. And if those agreements did not exist, there will be chaos in world trade. There's this sanitary and phytosanitary measures agreement, which protects human health and safety and makes sure that members don't use those things as barriers to trade, don't use measures in human health as barriers to trade from others, but also sets a floor for trading things so it can be trusted to protect human health and safety. Product standards, there's another one called technical barriers to trade. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't even have a platform upon which to build your own domestic legislation to safeguard your people. This is about trust in trade. You need to know what's arriving on your doorsteps. So beyond tariffs. Okay. And I think that's why WTO is important. But the appellate body, will the MPIA lead to ignoring the appellate body? The answer is no. All the members who are involved in the MPIA are just as desirous of having the appellate body come back restored. Maybe not exactly in the form it's in now, because we need to listen to some of the critiques of the US, which are valid, and take that into account in reforming the system. The second question on how can we establish boundaries with countries, establish boundaries with Trump whilst mitigating tariffs. I think it's all in dialogue. I really believe that.
And chilling.
And chilling, not reacting precipitously. I think that President Trump wants to be able to talk to the leaders, to explain what he wants. It may not always be pleasant, what he's seeking, but I think that you can get a win if you're willing to deal and to talk, and you can avoid the tariffs. I really believe that. So that is my answer to that. And then on the third question, balancing the compensation for IP with the desires of countries, I think there are two ways to do it, through voluntary mechanisms. That's what I was saying. We should protect research and innovation, but if the private sector is wise, when it has a product, after a given period of time, it should be reaching out to make transfer of technology agreements in other countries voluntarily. So you can have the agreement and protect your interests whilst also transferring technology to others without being forced.
Great. Let's try to take one more round of questions. We'll start over there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Director General. That was really interesting. I'm a student in international governance and diplomacy here.
A bit louder.
Sorry. In recent years, China has increasingly been criticized in engaging in overcapacity or overproduction, and especially Western countries have responded by implementing tariffs or other non-tariff trade defense mechanism. I was wondering what you make of such accusations, and what do you think could be a WTO compliant solution to those challenges?
Okay, great. Thanks, sir. Go ahead.
Many thanks. Adam DePico from Columbia University. It's lovely to see you again after your address at LSE 2 years ago, where I asked you a question on the weaponization of trade. Following up on that, many argue we have entered into an archipelago world, a world marked by great economic integration and deep geopolitical fragmentation. As such, as trade and supply chains become weaponized for political objectives, how can institutions like the WTO continue to be relevant, build consensus and this question of trust that you speak of, as well as remain a bastion of international standards against such international undercurrents? Thank you.
That's a big question. I thought we tried some of that already, but anyway, over there, and then we'll come back to you, and then I'll check to see how we're doing on time, but please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a master's student of international development, and my question is, what advice do you have for developing nations that need to diversify their national trade portfolio immediately, and what would be would have the most successful impact for improving their reputation in this sector, especially in light of the energy transition?
Thank you.
On the China question, this is a very important question. The accusations that China is, that there is overcapacity, it's overproducing, the trade imbalances with other countries, with the United States. This is such a big question. So I want to say one thing about China and the US trade. First of all, it's 3% of world trade. So many people do not know, but it garners so much attention. Everybody feels that this is the bulk of what China-US trade is 3% of world trade. So just bear that in mind. But that being said, these are the two largest economies. So whatever happens with this between them makes for repercussions. The issue between China and the US, and this is where trade is blamed unfairly sometimes. Trade imbalances in the case of China and US and some other countries is a symptom of something else. The actual problem is structural economic imbalances, macroeconomic imbalances that need to be solved, which is there's too little domestic consumption in China, and they need to ramp up. China's savings to GDP ratio is close to 45% or something like that, out of this world. There's too much consumption in the US and too little savings. So there are structural macroeconomic imbalances that have to be dealt with by these two countries. And I know they don't want to hear it, but that's the source of the problem. Even if you put tariffs on Chinese goods, yes, it will reduce the trade deficit of the US for a temporary time, but you're going to increase the cost of domestic goods in the US. You're going to increase the cost of US exports. The exchange rate is going to appreciate.
And so will inflation.
Inflation will go up, and you will just come back with the same imbalances in trade that you had before. So it's a macroeconomic phenomenon, and both ourselves and the fund, the IMF, have studied this very carefully. So until these two countries are ready to deal with these imbalances in China, and we have given the WTO, I've had the privilege of being able to have a bilateral with President Xi, as well as a meeting not long ago in Beijing about a month, just before Christmas. And we were able to convey some of these things, among other things, including subsidies, the need for China to be more transparent about its subsidy regime. If you're not transparent, people can make up numbers and say you're subsidizing this and that and the other. You can't prove it. So we've given very tough messages. I don't need to go into all of that. And built a relationship, a bit of trust, where you can deliver these messages. So this is part of the problem. And until we solve it, we'll be dealing with the symptoms. That being said, China really needs to pay attention because it has a trade surplus of almost $1 trillion this time around, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And people, the world is afraid of dumping, that if it cannot consume more goods, it's going to send them to other nations and so on. And so they don't believe in this overcapacity. They think they're being unfairly charged. China has its own accusations of the rest of the world, by the way, on agricultural subsidies and industrial subsidies. So it's a two-way thing at the WTO. But I think they are listening and trying to see how they can improve domestic consumption. Some of the recent measures they are looking at go in that direction. The second question, can WTO continue to be relevant in the midst of fragmentation? We are very concerned about the emerging fragmentation in world trade. But I do want to say one thing to you, part of my chill. As we speak, 80% of world's goods trade takes place on WTO terms. 80%. Total trade is $30.5 trillion, which is higher than the pre-pandemic peak of $25 trillion. We are still forecasting growth of 3% this year. It is below global growth and below trend growth. But I'm just trying to give you some numbers. When you speak to the private sector, those in supply chains, they always like it when I give these numbers because they see that world trade has been far more resilient. So whilst we need to be worried, we don't need to panic. Now, that being said, we're seeing increasing fragmentation. And you're saying, can the WTO be relevant in these circumstances? The answer is absolutely yes. Because we provide the fora where this fragmentation can be discussed among our members, dealt with, the problems that they are seeing vis-a-vis each other, whilst the protectionism is rising. It is rising. We see it in the number of measures. This is the place where they can really discuss and try to deal with it. So the relevance is even more than before. The third question on advice for diversification for developing countries, I alluded to it a bit earlier when I said that this is an opportune moment for developing countries. Instead of seeing problems, we should actually be looking at opportunities now because businesses want to build resilience in their supply chains. They are seeing the over-concentration in certain areas and in certain products, and they actually want to diversify. So if you're a clever developing country, you'll be doing everything possible now to attract investment into your country, to add value to your products so that you can diversify your economy by attracting different types of manufacturing and so on. So that's my answer.
Okay. I want to check with our Jefe. about time. Can we do another set of questions? Okay, fine. So let's start over here. And then we'll go over here, and we'll take a third over there, and then I think that'll be it. But please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Javier. I'm a student in the Masters of International Development. And my question is closely linked to the last question about developing countries. If we look at the WTO system since the 90s, it becomes clear that it hasn't delivered for developing countries. You just mentioned the numbers before of how Africa has been integrated into the global economic system, not just the amounts, but also the commodities and what is actually being traded. So yesterday we had a panel about the conference that is taking place in Seville in the end of June and beginning of July, and trade will also be an issue at this conference. So what do you think should be the priorities and the developments and reforms that should come out of this conference related to trade, so it delivers actually also for developing countries? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I'm Natalia. I'm a student in PSIA in International Economic Policy. My question is regarding sanctions. So in aggressive autocratic regimes, broad-term sanctions tend to disproportionately harm the general population rather than effectively deterring aggression. As both autocracy and aggression are increasing in today's world, do you see this role of the WTO, the scope of their responsibility, changing in response to, help people?
Thank you. And one more, please.
Hello, my name is Rhea. I'm doing the Masters in Governance and Diplomacy. We've spoken a lot about supply chains and decentralization, but it's often has a politically charged rhetoric around it, and it's not always received well, especially by those that currently hold a monopoly or majority control over certain chains. So how would you work your way around that?
Okay. Very good questions from everyone. Thank you. And again, don't forget, you can participate with our QR code.
On the issue of the trading system not having delivered for developing countries, I said yes, that there are poor countries that have been left out, and even poor regions of rich countries. But I don't think we should make a sweeping statement that it hasn't delivered. Remember, I started by saying trade has lifted 1.5 billion people out of extreme poverty. That is defined as those living under $2.15 a day. 1.5 billion. The whole East Asian miracle. People have forgotten that literature of the 90s. So you cannot say trade has not delivered. So I don't want to create another narrative that is wrong. Trade has largely delivered. So give me a bit of time for this, because this is fundamental. This whole system, yes, this whole system was created because 80 years ago it was felt after the Second World War that when countries are more interdependent and trade with each other, it will bring peace and prosperity to all. And that has been proven right, including in developing countries, 1.5 billion. East Asian countries are thriving. They benefited the most, but others did too. Some in Latin America, some in Africa, not as much. So I want that to be crystal clear. Developed countries benefited, including the USA. The USA has gained about $2.6 trillion through trade-related development by 2022. About 7 million jobs have been created, 2.4 million lost in manufacturing through China's competition. But they only talk about the losses. They don't talk about the almost 3 million jobs created in manufacturing, maybe not in the same areas, or the services jobs, which somehow are now seen as good jobs. It's only good manufacturing jobs. I don't know why services jobs are not good. Almost 4 million were created, so 7 million against a loss of 2.4. So developed and developing countries have benefited enormously through trade and globalization. The issue is those left behind. And that is why the World Trade Report of last year was trade and inclusion. How can we use trade to help those who were left behind? And so that's the legitimate question to ask. Those left behind, what do they need to do to trade more? Not that trade has not benefited. And the priorities, that's the topmost priority, to be very considered about what you're talking about. Who has been left behind? I gave you the Africa number, the least developed countries number. So those could be two starting points. Prioritize bringing them integrating them more into world trade. The Eastern European countries were initially left behind, but they've been integrated. So I would say for those countries, investment is a priority. So you should be looking at why are they not getting investment? What are the domestic policies that need to change? Why is the perception of risk so high? I was saying to EU leaders, instead of giving millions of dollars or hundreds of millions to keep migrants from Africa in the desert under terrible conditions, create a risk mitigation fund, first loss fund, so that businesses who think investing on the continent is risky will have a first loss facility that will de-risk the continent, and then they can invest in those countries and create jobs for the young people there. So those are the kinds of ideas. We don't have too much to have tons of ideas, but I don't have time to share. I'll just share that one, okay? So start thinking in that direction. 2, sanctions. Look, I said trade is being blamed for imbalances that are really due to structural macroeconomic problems in countries. Trade is also blamed and used as a weapon for political issues, security issues, you name it. Part of this is what is giving trade a bad name among young people. So if trade instruments are used as sanctions by countries, of course, you know, per our WTO rules, this may not be the right thing to do. But it is a little bit, it's quite difficult when you're looking at a political issue. So what we advise is if a WTO member feels that the trade instrument used against them is causing them harm, we have processes. They have to bring that report to they have to launch an investigation. By the way, that's what, if you look at the executive order on trade, it's not, no tariffs have been, it says study this, investigate that by President Trump. That's what has surprised people, that instead of coming on day one, he's actually asked. We actually support that. Do the investigation, show the harm being done to you, and bring it through the WTO system. So we have a system, and that's what I advise any member that is being harmed by other members. But many of them know that even if they bring it, it's a political or security issue, and they're looking better off maybe using other back channels than the WTO mechanism, but they do bring. So that gives room for dialogue. And that's what we can do, encourage contact. We've been managing Russia, Ukraine. We've been managing Israel and the Middle East, China, US. So my life every day is really managing these tensions on a real-time basis. And somehow we are getting through it. It's very difficult. The last question is on decentralization and monopoly and the rhetoric around it. Well, what you're finding now is that many businesses are seeing that it's in their interest to actually decentralize. So it's not something you can go and unless you're doing antitrust in the US or EU or something and say, you know, we break you up, you send. No, they have to make the right business decisions. And one of the things I just came from Davos. I've never had more requests from CEOs. This is the first time, like 30, 40, asking to speak, have a meeting. Why? It's not because they think I'm nice to talk to or something. It's because they are really thinking about those issues. How will I'm thinking of building resilience by decentralizing my value chains. What do you think these tariffs or this will do to me? Should I do that? So the business people are actually thinking in that direction. And I think that the conjuncture we find ourselves now, what they are telling me is they are looking at more regionalized supply chains. And, some supply chains for China, for the US, for others, and so on. I think this is the pattern we are going to see in the world going forward.
Great.
Thank
Well,
you.
this has been really instructive. I've learned a lot. So I would also like us first to thank Ngozi, but also ask the volunteers to come up to take a picture. So first, thank you.
By the way, you have someone who knows all these answers sitting right here. Arantxa knows everything, so you can always ask her.